Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing beautifully well. Today I'm going to be making my last foundation year term recap. I'll be talking about my term 3 at London College of Fashion in the International Preparation for Fashion degree. As usual, I'll be separating this video into parts, so the timestamps will be in the description below if you want to skip to any part of the video. I also will be sharing the example of my reflection that you will probably have to do if you do go to London College of Fashion, so hopefully that will help you give a sense of what to do. Before we start this video, I also want to say that I will be making a Q&A on my foundation degree, so if you have any questions at all, this is your chance to leave them down below and I will answer them in a future video. Anyway, I won't talk any longer, so without further ado, let's get started. Term 3 in itself was kind of complicated one for me because I was burnt out at this point. I didn't know what to do anymore with my projects, and I felt like foundation at LCF is a way to make a strong portfolio to enter a bachelor degree, and it kind of felt like it's starting to repeat itself, but that's for another video. I felt like I had already created something that was high enough of a standard to get me in, and I know that that's not the headspace that is right to be in, but I felt like I had given so much of myself the term before that I just wanted to have fun with this term, but my tutors were very adamant about keeping up the rhythm and keeping up kind of like the importance of my work while I kind of just wanted to play with it. I talked to my classmates about this term and we all agree that at this point we kind of just want to do what we want to do, and we were all really ready to go into our bachelor's degree and we were kind of done with foundation. It was a chapter that we were already all closing off. It was also a very short term. I think it was only like 5 weeks long, so it didn't really give us the motivation to make this big project if we knew we didn't have a lot of time, and when we already knew that this portfolio wasn't really going to be used to enter our bachelor's degree. It was called the personal progression project, so it was more personal and for you to develop your own work. I know a lot of people should be motivated about this, but when you give yourself so much to something and then they ask you to do it again, it's a lot. And you know, I was done at this point and I am so ready and excited to actually be in my degree. So moving on to my portfolio. This term we had absolutely free range of what we wanted to do. We had no word given to us. We just found a theme that we liked and we developed it. And at first I wanted to do something deep again and something important, but as I started doing research on those topics that I had in mind, I kind of gave up very quickly on them just because I realized how little time I had and how I should just use this to my advantage to do something that holds less importance than I care to admit. So as you guys are going to see throughout my portfolio, I started off with a main idea and it really changed throughout the 5 weeks. So my final project wasn't particularly about my beginning theme. It was kind of a mix of the beginning of my theme and also kind of the research I did later on. So the first thing I did was make a mind map. So my main theme was junk culture, and I was intrigued by the idea of why people are obsessed with collecting things and hoarding and why it is so negatively viewed. So I asked myself questions such as, what are the most common objects that we collect and keep? What is hoarding in general? What does that mean? How does that affect someone's mental health and being? How is art related to collection, and what sort of art can you make out of junk culture? So yeah, my main idea was mainly to look at collectors and collections and flea markets, etc. Then I went to go see this exhibition called Small is Beautiful. I would highly recommend it if you're in London to go see it. It is quite impressive. It's basically these art creations that are super tiny, and some are made out of recycled pieces and reused items. So these were my 3 favorite artists that I saw. Mini Miam was a mini world of food leftovers, so it kind of created its own space and environment with leftover foods. It was very reminiscent of my childhood and how I would play around with little things that I found in my home. There was also Vincent Bal, who created shadows with objects and then drew over the shadows to make a story. And finally there was Slinkashu, which went out into the street or nature and created like these mini worlds that seem very big, but when you actually see them in real life they're super small and you can barely see them. Then I started digging into junk culture as a whole, and I started looking at articles as to why people collect junk. Where does it begin? Where does it end? How do people get into hoarding? I also made another mind map on top because I had more questions that I asked myself throughout my research. Afterwards, I came across these artists called Patrick and Bridget who make pieces of art out of junk, and it's all recycled pieces, and I thought it was super interesting to read about their story and how they kind of came about to start making these pieces. I read this article about them talking about how they were big on advocating for reusing items not only as utilitarian objects but also as art, and how that can help our landfills. Then after I thought about the most common places that I find hold a lot of memories and hoarding items, and when I say hoarding, it's not a negative term, it's just hoarding in general, that's what it's called, so please don't come at me. But I thought about flea markets and vintage markets and just markets in general, and so I kind of looked into the history of flea market and also what the difference is between hoarding versus collecting and what the fine line is between those two things. Also was interested in how flea markets kind of impact our modern world and the seasonal concept of markets and how they are only present during certain times of the years, how they're often set up along the streets, and kind of the environment that we can find them in. I was then very intrigued about collecting as a whole, so if collecting can be shared or if it's a very personal thing. I then came across a psychologist called Mueller who wrote a book called Inside the Head of a Collector and kind of the psychological impacts of collecting. She talks about something called the oddball effect, where on the right I talk a little bit more about it, which is kind of an intriguing experiment where it explores how the brain reacts when an atypical event happens within typical events. So there was a study done where there were people that were looking at black and white images, and then throughout that series of images there was one picture of color. That picture of color was said to have stayed on screen for much longer than the other pictures, but it actually was not. So that kind of ties back into when collectors find an item of value and how the brain reacts to those things. Then when I was in the library, I came across this book called This Is Blythe, and I thought it was so intriguing because it was basically this doll that was taken in different parts of the world, and at first when I looked at it I was like, this is really weird. I don't know, I kind of don't know how I feel about this. And I looked more into it and I started thinking about if this falls under kind of the category of high art or low art, and that sense of nostalgia that that book brought me because it reminded me of my childhood and when I used to bring my dolls on vacation and I would take pictures of them on the beach or something like that, and it was this sense of familiarity in a way. I also looked at this collector called, I'm gonna mess up his name, Jian Yang, I'm so sorry, who has a collection of over 12,000 dolls, which was super impressive and kind of his analogy behind why he collects them. And I looked at another collector called Jim Golden, who is also a photographer, and he photographs his collections. And he looks at dimensions and ways of reflecting the light to make it look visually appealing, and his color themes and how that impacts the whole image as an entirety. Afterwards, I was talking to my friend about my project, and she told me to look at Erwin Worm, who made this exhibition of 1-minute sculptures where people were given 1 or 2 objects and to pose with them in the weirdest way that they can. And so I looked at articles about this exhibition and I thought it was so weird, but also how amazing art can just be in its simplest form and still be intriguing and have meaning behind it. At this point, I looked at so many images and so many different artists, and some were really weird to me. I thought that I would kind of dig more into why I thought these things were weird and the weirdness of weirdness. And so this was a book that I read on the weirdness of weirdness and why we think that things are weird and where that derives from, and kind of the line that you think is weird is impacted by how you have been brought up, and if you were exposed to many things as a child or if you were very reserved and you kind of kept within your box, how it's subjective to each individual and how weirdness is a spectrum. And then on the right I did a quick self-reflection at this point, and I would highly suggest doing this in your guys' project too. This is really helpful for your tutors to understand where your thoughts are coming from in your project, and it's just a good way for you as well to kind of put yourself on the right path and not get too overwhelmed with all the information available out there. And then I looked at books that had art pieces that a lot of people don't understand, such as Dali sculptures and Duchamp's Dada movement art pieces, Always annotate so that your teachers can kind of know where you're coming from and what you're thinking when you're looking at these articles and these pictures and sculptures. Oh, this was a weird page. So we were asked in class to look at one object related to our subject or our theme and kind of make drawings out of it so that we can brainstorm what we want to do for a final outcome. Art school is weird, okay? Don't ask me. I came across this foot door stopper and I thought it was very related to my project because it's very creative, but it's so weird. Like, who would have a foot as a door stopper? It's over there right now holding my closet door open if you're curious to know. But yeah, I just observed this foot in different angles and thought about what I could make if I were to make something out of this foot stopper. So quick sketches and what this object reminds me of in my project. Here I went to a flea market in Deptford. If you don't know, Deptford Market is a big market that happens on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. And there's a lot of cheap stuff over there and lots of options, and I would highly recommend going. I went there and I took pictures of strange objects and wondering how they ended up there. I also looked at an article about childhood and adolescence. How when we're children we are so prone to playing with toys and dolls, but then as we grow up we just begin to think it's weird and kind of that dolls take this creepy significance to us. I then looked at Sigmund Freud, who talked about the uncanny valley. If you don't know what the uncanny valley is, it is what I was talking about 2 seconds ago about how media in general turns sweet, innocent children's toys into this very creepy thing that we grow to dislike as we grow older. And Sigmund Freud created theories about the uncanny valley and how kind of thoughts impact body and how the human mind works in general. He wrote an essay about the uncanny valley and Freud's interpretation of it. So I analyzed his essay and kind of integrated my own thoughts into what he was saying, and I thought it was so interesting. I also looked at this diagram by Who's kind of the explanation of the uncanny valley. I also looked at the Quay brothers, who I think were part of the Toy Story movie and their reproduction of it, and how they take dolls and give them this very creepy factor, and how does that affect our mind. And then here was a quick brainstorm of final ideas and kind of the advice that my friends were given to me. This was done in class. It's very important to show your process of your final outcome. And then here was my mood board and the color scheme and the photographers that I was going to be inspired by for my final project. These were the test shoots that I did. I went to the Deptford Market like 5 times and I took a bunch of pictures. I knew that I wanted my project to be in black and white just because it kind of gives that old feeling to it, that creepiness. So I went and took test shoots. The stands that are at Deptford Market are the same every time I went. So I looked at the places that I wanted to shoot and plan what I wanted to do with the stands available. These were some more test shoots that I did playing with lighting and some dolls that I had bought at the market and testing what looks creepiest, what looks best, what works and what doesn't. Some more test shoots of my friends when I brought them to the market and testing out poses, testing out settings, testing out lighting. Some more again, I completely hated these pictures, that's why I brought them all out, but it was really important for me to show that I actually went out and did work. So that's why I included these. Some more test shoots. Here was my styling page. It's very basic just because I didn't want to go overboard with it. At this point I was really done with school and I was burnt out, so proof of this. But yeah, it's super simple, but I wanted my model to wear something that was childish but also representative of growing up and kind of that mental conflict that you get when you're in that in-between stage of I'm still a child but I'm being treated as an adult, or I'm an adult and still being treated as a child. So that's why I wanted them to wear a tutu and a tie to show that conflict. Now moving on to my final outcome. My first page is a page introducing my project, so it's called Don't Let Me Go, place a bet that I won't be here in 5 years. And then on the right it has a short kind of script that says, I just don't feel like myself, you know. She stroked my hair and told me that it's only fair, you're just confused and I don't approve, this will pass soon, don't let it get to you. But what if I don't ever find my place? What if I'm neither one? This might end up a cold case and I'll be that someone. It doesn't really matter anyway, but you might need a label someday. I dropped my head in my hands, covering my dread. I didn't want this to have any explicit meaning because I wanted everyone to interpret it the way they wanted to interpret it, but for me, it talks about growing up and being confused with one's identity. Like I was talking about, that conflict between wanting to grow up but also wanting to stay a child. And so here are my final pictures. And then for the final part of my portfolio, which was my reflective summary. My reflective summary was about my whole school year, so I will be linking my term 1 and my term 2 recap in the cards up top if you want to check it out. But my summary is about all terms, so if you're confused about what I'm saying in this paragraph, go watch my 2 other videos and you'll probably get a good sense of what I'm saying. As a 19-year-old, there are very few moments in my life that I have felt have been life-changing. Taking the big leap to move to a new city that I had never been to before was definitely a part of those life-changing moments. Not only did an education in the arts open my eyes to what an ideal education for me could be like, but also having the possibility to discover something more suited for my abilities. As I arrived and settled into the course, a realization that my initial idea of what my next couple of years here would look like had dawned on me. Having an open mind and being comfortable with changing my primary plan helped me to propel me in the right direction of my pathway choice. Although uncertainty can still be felt on my part, I do believe that the sphere of media is by far what resonates most with me. As I got to fully immerse myself into that domain in term 2, I became a critical thinker in a way that I had never been challenged to do before. Conversations and discussions in class made my mind, beliefs, and values expand. I was captivated by the question of education as a whole and discovered through my peers and tutors that questioning my position as a student and what was taught in an educational establishment was crucial for my development as a customer of pedagogy. It challenged me to not be as naive and to not be as blinded to what was presented to me. As I explored the topic of education, my whole perception flipped and made me realize how in control I should feel of my work. I grasped complex academic debates that we explored in class and spent most of my time outside of school conducting research. I spent a lot of time focusing on the material that I delayed completing my final outcome, which led me to not have as strong as an outcome compared to my research. I knew then, after submitting my work in term 2, that for term 3, I would choose a less complex topic and would focus more for the most part on producing strong final images. I personally feel as though I have accomplished producing a stronger final outcome in this term, even though I do know and understand that there's definitely still room for improvement. My end result for the previous term was mostly meant for me to showcase my comprehension of the deliberations made in class, not as much meant for it being a wow factor. However, it was important for me that this term would be spent focusing more on the technical part of my project, such as images, lighting, styling, makeup, and hair, so that my outcome could have that wow factor missing in my previous project. My challenge for my next projects and starting in my bachelor degree will have to be finding a balance between research and final product for it not only to show my understanding of the resources given, but also for it to have that impressive aspect. Having these next couple of months during the summer to reflect and come up with concepts that I find captivating will rejuvenate and motivate me to come back stronger for my first year in my undergraduate degree. Here was my bibliography, and that was it. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, guys. I really hope you enjoyed, and as usual, if you have any recommendations or any questions, leave them down below and I'll try my best to get back to you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye!